Definitely be a momentous moment for a country smarting for decades of misrule. ZanuPF and the MDC Alliance are the leading parties. Now, traditionally, Bulawayo has been the center of the opposition, but the various splinter groups from the opposition MDC may impact on which party emerges victorious. Our reporter Tsepiso Makwetla is in Bulawayo. Tsepiso, now we do know that there is a fight for the two major cities, Harare and Bulawayo. We know traditionally that Bulawayo has been for or against, has been for the MDC. What is happening on the ground? What are you sensing?
Well, Kashini, it's very hard to say at this point who's going to vote which way. People are, especially here in Bulawayo, a little bit more reserved in their opinion on, or let me not say in their opinion, on their intentions on whom they're going to vote for, because you would imagine that people from these parts would have come under, in some cases, a severe punishment for supporting one party or the other, and in most cases that would be the opposition party. So they are a little recalcitrant to say whom they're voting for, but they have indicated that they are voting. And we've seen just today on the streets of Joshua Nkomo. We are in downtown Bulawayo. Just behind me, I'm sure you can see a picture of the founding, or rather a monument of the founding father Joshua Nkomo behind me. And a number of inebriated youths, I must say, have been coming up talking to us. One of them making a rather worrying statement about the fact that should MDC not win, they are prepared to take up the cudgels and even threaten civil war. But as I said, it's inebriated youth, but there are others who are out on the streets who are saying that they are definitely going to vote. With me is political commentator Brezhnev Matonzi to talk a little bit more about not only the atmosphere here in Bulawayo, but I'm thinking in the country today, what do you think Zimbabweans are thinking about that press briefing by former President Robert Mugabe? Do you think that he was seeking some sort of absolution, or some sort of, or the last kick of a dying horse, as some have said, in trying to determine Zimbabwe's trajectory?
Well, I think, if anything, Zimbabweans were irritated by that interview, by that press conference by the former president, Robert Mugabe. I think they see him as a past that they want to forget. I think they see him as someone who's desperately, continuously trying to hold on to some semblance of relevancy. So I don't think they made much of it, except to see a reminder of something they will quickly want to forget.
Brezhnev, what about brand Nelson Chamisa or brand MDC Alliance? The fact that reluctantly President Mugabe said if anybody else, that's who he will support. He didn't necessarily speak about endorsement, but he said that who he'll support.
Well, I think it's probably late for the brand to be affected in any way, except that I think it's a political strategy by the alliance to try and ensure that they get votes in the Mashonaland provinces, the rural provinces where they have failed to beat ZanuPF in the past. So I think the idea is to try and get the G40 element, which is said to be part of Mugabe, or to have Mugabe as their godfather. So I think the idea really is to try and get those votes to come in for their side.
And the current administration, ZanuPF, do you think there'll be any fallout as a result of the comments made by President Robert Mugabe? He certainly held back no punches in his criticism of Emerson Mnangagwa and how he came into power, but his character as well.
I think Robert Mugabe is a frail, old man. I think he's an old man that has no influence anymore in the country. I think actually the Mnangagwa government is handling him and is allowing him to speak or to appear as they please. It would have been expected that if Mugabe was really behind the NPF, he would have come out much earlier to endorse Nelson Chamisa to be able to win some of those Mashonaland provinces. But I think the fact that they allowed him to come out only at the last minute shows you that this is a man who really has no influence. Most of his allies are powerless. Some of them are out of the country. Some of them have been labeled criminals. So I don't really see where and how he would be able to influence in any way. I really think he's someone from the past who has really lost most of his powers.
I want to talk about how he seemed to couch his tenure. He said Zimbabweans have always been free, they've always had the ability of freedom of expression for the political parties that they support, and he called for a change to that tomorrow in the outcome of the vote, suggesting that there is no democracy at the moment. Was he rewriting history?
Well, if he was, like I said, I think it was a little too late, and it's at the final hour of the election. So I think he's a man who is bitter. He's a man who is angry at his colleagues, and really that was his opportunity to almost sort of try and vent out part of that anger.
The reason I ask this is because tomorrow the elections start at 7 a.m. More than 10,000 polling stations open so that people can make their mark. But there is a distinct difference this time round, and that there are Western observers, as it were. And he'd always argued that their presence sought to weaken Zimbabwe's sovereignty.
Yes, that is true. I think what has happened is that the current government and the Emmerson Mnangagwa-led ZanuPF is really desperate for legitimacy. So unlike Mugabe, who really had divorced himself and disengaged himself from the West and was really looking east, this current government has said they want a new dispensation. But above all, they are trying to find some legitimacy. And the quickest way to get that legitimacy is to ensure that you have election observers from all around the world who will come in and say, okay, this election was free, fair, or it was credible, and then they are able to start working.
What is your point of view? Scholars have argued about this particular question of whether or not international observers weaken or strengthen the sovereignty of a country, whether it be popular sovereignty or national sovereignty.
Well, I think there's a difference there then between election observers and election monitors, right? With observers being or having much less influence in how the election is eventually carried out. But I think naturally, because we are in a global community, it is then understandable that for you to have any sort of legitimacy, you need to have the international community, you need to have the regional blocs having observed that election and having agreed to you having had a legitimate thing.
There are those, whether or not they're being spoilers for accepted principles, say, but donor funding also plays a huge role in whether or not a nation can fulfill its obligations to put on a plebiscite for the people to exercise their political rights. And Zimbabwe, we know, was cash-strapped and has received donor funds for this election. Is that something where people are just putting a spanner in the works, or is that of legitimate concern?
Well, I think naturally, if you look at the Zimbabwean economy that has been diving for quite a while with cash shortages and scarce foreign resources or forex, so to speak, it would have been almost impossible to hold the election without some form of donor assistance from the international community. So, but I still think the election is then able to be credible without necessarily having these donor agencies playing an influence on the election.
And of course, the flip side is others are saying the fact that Zimbabwe has used the excuse in inverted commas of lack of funding to close out other potential voters by saying that those outside of the borders of the country cannot vote, or people of a certain age cannot be included, is a means of manipulating the outcome of the election. But we will certainly be on the ground in Harare, Bulawayo, to let you know how the people of Zimbabwe exercise their right to vote. Kirshni.